The boy was the first to change. Hard ridges pierced through the skin, and small white teeth emerged on his arm, where no teeth should be. His muffled cries carried down the town, too sharp to be mistaken for a sickness. In the months that followed, his sisters started to show the same signs. Their shoulders bent, their backs pressed against fabric that could no longer hide the white teeth points piercing through. The family withdrew inside their house. Curtains stayed drawn, doors unlatched but never open. Their absence in town fed the stories. Their absence in town spoke louder than words, and their house became a place people hurried past without mention. Neighbors whispered. Some said it was a curse. Others talked about it was because of the family bloodline closing in on itself because of inbreeding. But all of them agreed that it was no ordinary illness. Townspeople repeated the stories until the family's name carried more fear than a memory. A household once ignored became remembered only in dread. What type of inbreeding could cause a body to grow teeth from its skin? And why did no one step forward when the suffering was plain to see? Before we go any further, I want to ask you, where are you watching from? And what hour is it over there right now? Leave your answer in the comments below, and while you are here with us, make sure you subscribe to X Archives so these accounts, sealed, buried, and almost forgotten, can be opened again. At the far edge of the ridge, where the dirt path thinned and the trees pressed close, stood a house that most in town only spoke of in passing. It sat half sunken into the hillside, boards darkened by weather and years of disrepair. Its roof sloped too low, as though the earth itself were trying to swallow it back. Smoke rose weakly from its chimney in winter, but in the warm months no sign of life could be seen except for a faint movement behind the curtains. The family who lived there had long been a presence without being present. They were known in name but rarely in sight, appearing only for supplies when the journey could no longer be delayed. Even then they spoke little, moved quickly, and returned to the ridge before questions could be asked. Children in town learned to point toward the hollow with whispers, repeating things they had heard at home, that no one should wander too far down the path, that the family there kept to themselves because it was better that way. Isolation was not unusual in those mountains, but theirs had a weight to it. Neighbors remembered small encounters, an exchange of flour, a passing word at market, but always with a sense of distance. The hollow seemed to absorb sound, as if the trees themselves conspired to keep the house unseen. Footsteps slowed when travelers passed that way. Some swore the ridge path narrowed more sharply near the property, as though the land itself wished to keep strangers out. The family's days were lived quietly. The father tended a small patch of ground with tools worn smooth. The mother seen sometimes at the well, pulling water with her head bent low. The children, when glimpsed at all, stayed close to the walls, rarely venturing into the yard. Their voices were never heard in play. It was not cruelty that kept them silent, it was habit, a rhythm set by a household where silence was safer than sound. Over time, the family's absence from the rhythms of town became ordinary. At church gatherings their pew sat empty. At festivals they were never mentioned. If asked directly, most would shrug. They live there, they always have, and perhaps it is better not to disturb what prefers to remain apart. Yet unease carried beneath that surface calm. A house so quiet for so long could not help but invite speculation. Were they unwell? Were the hiding shame or guarding something worse? Each season seemed to deepen the distance, the family withdrawing further from even the smallest of contact. The hollow kept its secrets well until one summer when the eldest boy was seen at the edge of the path. His shirt hung loose in the heat, yet his right arm was bound tightly in cloth, pressed against his side as if he dared not let it move. His face revealed nothing, but the stiffness in his body suggested strain. Those who saw him recalled the look not of injury, but of concealment. What first seemed like illness soon became impossible to explain. The eldest boy was the first to draw attention, though not in a way he wished. In summers past, he had been glimpsed near the yard with his younger sisters, standing watch more than joining in their quiet play. By the year he turned 12, even that presence seemed altered. He carried himself differently, shoulders tightened, one arm bent stiff against his body as if pinned there by habit. The ridge grew hot in July, the air heavy and thick, yet he wore a shirt buttoned at the wrist. The sleeve hung oddly, never shifting with movement. Neighbors who passed on the path, rare though they were, noticed his strange manner of holding it close, as though any brush might cause pain. When spoken to, he answered briefly, eyes averted, before retreating back toward the house. Other children saw it most clearly. On the rare occasions he neared the schoolhouse fence or crossed the clearing, he refused to join games. He stood apart, arm tucked tightly in place, turning away when boys asked what was wrong. They teased him at first, as children will, but the laughter stopped when he failed to react. His silence unnerved them more than anger might have. Soon they left him out entirely, whispering that he carried some hidden sickness. One afternoon, while following the path home, he stumbled. His sleeve slipped back, and for a moment something pale showed through the fabric. The boy pulled the cloth down quickly, but not before a neighbor saw the shape, ridges rising under the skin, like the outline of small stones set too close together. No wound, no bruise, something else pressing outward, waiting. The story spread quietly, retold in kitchens and under porches. Some said it was no more than bone grown wrong. Others insisted it was a sign of blood too tangled, too close. Whatever the cause, no one confronted the family directly. Curiosity did not overcome the instinct to keep distance from the hollow. The boy himself grew more withdrawn. He avoided the clearing where children gathered, choosing longer routes to keep unseen. His movements slowed, cautious, as if any sudden gesture might split the skin. What strength he had went into holding the arm close, hiding the truth beneath fabric and silence. By the close of summer, the whispers had grown sharper. The boy was no longer merely strange. He was becoming a warning. Mothers told their children not to linger near the ridge. Fathers carried their tools more quickly past that bend in the path. And still, from the house, the boy appeared with his sleeve pulled tight, as though nothing had changed. But it had. For beneath the cloth, the ridges sharpened, their outlines hard against his skin. In the weeks ahead, they would not remain hidden. They would break the surface, and what emerged was neither wound nor scar, but something hard, white, and impossible to deny. It began as a single break in the skin, a split no larger than a fingernail. The boy tried to cover it with cloth, but the wound refused to close. Instead, something pale pressed forward, sharper with each day, until it punctured through entirely. What emerged was not bone, not splinter, but a tooth, white and complete, as if it had grown where no mouth should be. At first there was blood. It welled darkly around the edges, streaking down his arm before drying into a crust against the sleeve. The boy muffled his cries into his bedding, forcing the sound down into the wooden floorboards so the hollow would not carry it outward. Yet the walls of the house did nothing to contain the truth. Neighbors passing below swore they heard strained sounds, neither cough nor fever, but something heavier, an anguish that seemed to cut through wood and air alike. As days passed, more followed. Small incisors pressed from the flesh of his forearm, each one ringed in red, holding fast though the body resisted them. He tried to pry them loose, tearing skin raw, but they would not release. They were rooted deep, bound in place like teeth in a jaw. His parents offered no explanation. The father turned his face to the ground, tending soil that refused to grow. The mother pulled water from the well at dawn, hands shaking on the rope. When asked in town about the boy, they gave no words at all. Their silence fed suspicion more than denial ever could. Inside, the boy wrapped the arm in layer after layer of cloth. But when sweat soaked through, the outlines showed clearly, ridges and points pressing against the fabric. The more he tried to hide them, the more visible they became. In the close heat of the hollow, he grew thin and pale, his movements stiff with both pain and secrecy. The other children whispered of him. They said he had broken his bones so often they now splintered outward. Others claimed his blood was changing, turning hard. None of them imagined the truth. The teeth were forming where no teeth had right to grow. The cries grew sharper at night. Sometimes they ended in silence, sudden and complete, as if someone pressed a hand over his mouth. Other times they dragged on, low and ragged, until even the crickets ceased their song. Those who lived closest to the ridge began avoiding the path entirely after dusk, unwilling to hear what the house contained. The boy's suffering was not fleeting. The teeth remained, anchored and immovable, as if the body itself had accepted them. His skin healed around their bases, reddened and stretched, sealing them into place. The more he fought against them, the deeper their roots seemed to grow, and still he was not alone. In the weeks that followed, his sisters began to change, shoulders stiff, backs hunched, movements hidden beneath heavy cloth. The same pale ridges rose slowly beneath their skin, waiting for their own moment to break through. The boy's agony was only the beginning. The boy's struggle might have been dismissed as an isolated deformity, a cruel twist of his body alone, but within months it became clear he was not the only one marked. His sisters, younger and quieter, began to show the same signs, first in their posture, then in their skin. Their shoulders stiffened as though carrying unseen weight. They began to hold themselves close, arms folded not in shyness, but in concealment. Beneath their dresses, small ridges formed along their backs, shifting under fabric when they moved. At first they were dismissed as bones too sharp, the kind seen in children thinned by poor diet. But soon the outlines sharpened, and the truth forced itself forward. From their skin-pressed teeth, not a row nor a jaw, but scattered growths, white and gleaming against raw flesh. They emerged slowly, stretching the skin before piercing through in uneven clusters. Some protruded cleanly, their edges catching the light. Others grew bent, lodged partly beneath the surface, leaving bulges that never fully broke through. Neighbors glimpsed them only once or twice when the girls ventured outside too quickly. A collar shifted, or a sleeve slipped, and for an instant the shapes were visible. The sight spread unease faster than rumor ever could. Children whispered about mouths on their shoulders, and grown men crossed themselves without a word. Few spoke of it openly, but in private kitchens the story spread. Whatever afflicted the boy was not his alone, and it was moving through the blood of the family. The parents did nothing to correct the whispers. Instead, they drew their children further inward. The sisters no longer lingered near the yard. Curtains that once fluttered in summer stayed shut, blocking even the smallest view into the house. The garden went untended. The path to the well grew overgrown, as if even water was fetched under cover of night. Though she who passed the ridge spoke of movement behind glass but never faces, of shadows that seemed always to recede when watched. It was as if the family believed that if no one saw them, no one would remember what was happening. But secrecy worked against them. The more they vanished from view, the more the town spoke of them. The girls themselves grew pale, their figures thin beneath heavy fabric worn even in the hottest weeks. They clutched their clothing at the seams, pulling collars high and wrapping shawls tight, desperate to contain what could not be hidden. When they walked, their movements were careful, strained, as though any sudden motion might split their skin further. Their silence deepened the dread. No laughter, no cries, only the sound of steps retreating indoors. By autumn, the family was gone from every gathering. The church pew where they once sat remained empty, week after week. Their absence was noted but never spoken of by name. Neighbors understood without words. The family on the ridge no longer belonged to the community. They had chosen the shadows of their house over the sight of their neighbors. It was not merely retreat. It was the beginning of a deeper withdrawal, one that would cut them off entirely, leaving only a house marked by silence and suspicion. The family began to close themselves away. By the time the leaves fell that year, the family had vanished from sight. The church pew where they once sat stood empty week after week, and soon even the smallest expectation of their return faded. Their absence was not explained, not excused, simply accepted with a quiet understanding that whatever had taken hold of them was no longer meant to be witnessed by others. The curtains stayed drawn through every season. At first, neighbors thought it a sign of illness or grief, the kind of mourning that kept people hidden until strength returned. But strength never did. The windows remained sealed, the house dark even in daylight, its stillness broken only by faint movements glimpsed between the folds of cloth. Smoke from the chimney rose less often, as if the family was shrinking not only from the world, but from life itself. The children, once occasionally seen in the yard or along the path, disappeared entirely. No shouts, no laughter, not even the sound of footsteps on dirt. The hollow fell into silence, broken only by the hum of insects or the call of birds. Where once there had been the faint suggestion of a household, chores half done, voices carried across a field, there was now only stillness. Neighbors who passed began to quicken their steps. A house that showed no life became a weight on the land, an unease that pressed down on anyone who lingered too long nearby. Travelers who knew nothing of the family still felt it, remarking that the ridge seemed too quiet, too watchful, as if the trees themselves bore witness to something best left unspoken. The family name was rarely used in town. When it did surface, it was spoken softly, almost unwillingly, as though saying it aloud might draw the sickness closer. Children were hushed if they dared mention it. Adults exchanged glances instead of words, carrying the silence like a burden. It was easier not to name them, easier to let them become only the family on the ridge. The house itself grew into a story. Some claimed they saw shadows moving in the windows after dark. Others swore they heard faint cries carried on the wind, muffled but sharp enough to chill the blood. No one investigated. Curiosity was outweighed by fear, and fear kept the ridge path empty. What once had been the home of a family became, in the minds of the townsfolk, a place where something unnatural was unfolding. Secrecy gave no protection. The less the family was seen, the more the town imagined. What illness, what curse, what sin could drive them so completely from the world? What did they fear being witnessed? The answers were left to speculation, and speculation rarely showed mercy. The house was no longer simply theirs. It had become the subject of whispers, a mark on the town that no one wished to claim. And though the family may have hoped to bury themselves in silence, their absence shouted louder than their presence ever had. But the changes could not be hidden forever. The silence of the house did not remain contained within the hollow. In town, it grew into words, words that carried quickly and settled deep, reshaping how the family was remembered. At first, neighbors spoke cautiously, lowering their voices when the subject arose. Illness was the simplest explanation, a lingering fever or wasting condition that kept them confined. But as weeks stretched into months, simpler explanations no longer held. The stories changed with each telling. Some said the family was being punished for sins unconfessed, that their retreat from church was proof enough. Others spoke of curses laid generations before, carried forward through blood that had never mixed with outsiders. In the mountains, bloodlines ran close, and whispers of inbreeding were never far behind. Here, those whispers sharpened into certainty. People said the family's blood had folded in on itself too many times, until even their bodies began to betray the secret. Children repeated what they heard at home. In the schoolyard, the family's name became a game, a chant whispered behind hands, each retelling more grotesque than the last. They spoke of hidden mouths on arms and backs, of skin splitting to reveal rows of teeth. Some dared each other to walk the ridge path at dusk, but few carried through. When the teachers overheard the talk, they silenced it harshly, ordering the children to hold their tongues. Yet silence in the classroom only drove the stories deeper, passed along in corners and alleys where no correction could reach. Adults tried to avoid the subject, but unease marked their gatherings. At market stalls, when the ridge was mentioned, shoulders tightened and eyes shifted away. The family was no longer simply absent. They had become a warning. Farmers muttered that their fields withered when watered from the same spring. Mothers kept their children close, steering them down longer routes to avoid the hollow entirely. Fear of what was unseen grew heavier than anything that might have been spoken plainly. Isolation fed the stories. Each curtain drawn across the windows, each week without a face in town, gave the whispers more strength. The less people saw, the more they imagined, and imagination showed no restraint. The family became less a household than a shadow cast over the ridge, a shadow that stretched farther with every season of silence. Still, fragments of truth slipped through. On rare occasions, the children were glimpsed near the edge of the yard, clothed in garments far too heavy for the weather. Long sleeves bound their arms, collars fastened tight to the throat, fabric drawn close as though to shield more than modesty. The sight gave weight to what had been dismissed as rumor. Even those who had doubted now found themselves wondering what such cloth was meant to conceal. The family's clothing gave away what words would not. By midsummer, the heat on the ridge was nearly unbearable, yet the family's children appeared swaddled in layers that made no sense to those who saw them. Long sleeves clung to their wrists, collars drawn tight around pale throats, fabric heavy enough for winter, though the air itself shimmered with heat. Neighbors whispered that the garments were meant for modesty, but the truth showed itself in the way the cloth shifted. The shapes beneath could not be disguised. Strange bulges pressed against sleeves and backs, stiff outlines that moved when the children walked. At first they seemed like bones grown sharp from hunger, ribs and shoulders too thin for skin to hide. But the forms were irregular, clustered, rising not in the pattern of a skeleton, but in points and ridges that caught the light when fabric stretched taut. Children in town who glimpsed them grew restless. They whispered that the clothing was not protection, but a cage to hold something inside. Some claimed they saw edges, white and hard, pressing against the cloth as though teeth themselves were straining to break through. Adults dismissed the stories aloud, yet their eyes betrayed unease when they saw the collars and sleeves drawn tighter than before. The family endured it in silence. The mother adjusted hems and stitched seams, keeping the fabric close. The father carried on with bowed head, offering no word when neighbors passed on the path. The children themselves held their clothing at the edges, tugging sleeves down, pulling collars higher, clutching shawls until their knuckles whitened. It was an act of desperation, not vanity, an attempt to appear normal while the body fought to betray them. The longer they concealed, the more visible the effort became. Sweat soaked the cloth, darkening it to reveal the outlines beneath. Movements slowed, as if each gesture required calculation to keep fabric in place. And their silence deepened, voices muffled, steps shortened. Even from a distance, something unnatural clung to the way they carried themselves. Neighbors grew sharper in their avoidance. Markets fell silent when the family passed. Paths cleared without a word. Fear, once whispered in kitchens, now traveled openly in the way people moved their children aside, the way doors closed as the Ridge family walked by. The sight of their heavy garments in summer became enough to quiet a gathering, as though everyone understood, but no one dared speak it aloud. The house itself became their final refuge. Curtains never lifted. Yard lay overgrown. Windows reflected only shadows shifting behind cloth. The family tried to bury themselves in secrecy, but secrecy had turned into spectacle. What they covered spoke louder than what they revealed. And when day ended, concealment gave way to something worse. For at night, the house could no longer hold its silence. Strained cries, muffled at first, carried across the hollow, unnatural in tone, unlike any sickness neighbors had ever known. At night, the house itself revealed the struggle. When daylight faded and the ridge fell into shadow, the family's silence broke. From behind the closed curtains and shuttered windows came sounds that froze even the most seasoned neighbors in their tracks. At first they resembled the moans of sickness, strained but familiar enough to be dismissed. Soon, though, they grew sharper, half-choked cries that rose and fell like something tearing its way through flesh. The noise carried strangely across the hollow. Crickets and nightbirds fell silent when it began, leaving the air thinner, emptier, as if the land itself recoiled. Those who lived closest learned to keep their lamps unlit, to move quietly indoors long before dusk, unwilling to hear what the house could not contain. The cries never followed the rhythm of fever. They did not come with coughing fits or the restless groans of sleep. Instead, they broke suddenly. One moment silence, the next a ragged, guttural sound that lingered before collapsing into quiet again. It was the kind of noise that seemed to come not only from a mouth but from the body itself, as if flesh and bone were locked in battle. On some nights, the voices were muffled, pressed down as if a hand forced them into silence. On others, they carried unchecked, filling the hollow with such raw anguish that even the dogs in town whined and hid beneath porches. Mothers pressed their children closer in their beds, whispering prayers, telling them to shut their ears against it. Fathers rose before dawn to check their fields, eyes weary from nights spent listening, powerless to intervene. No one climbed the ridge to help. Pity might have stirred them once, but pity had long since been replaced by dread. To step onto that path after nightfall was to invite something home with you, an unease that clung long after the sounds had stopped. It was easier to stay away, to let the family fight its hidden struggle. 1. Whispers in town hardened. Some insisted the cries were the punishment of a curse unraveling through blood. Others said they were proof of inbreeding, that what had been whispered for generations was now showing itself plainly in the flesh. Whatever the explanation, the noise confirmed what silence had only suggested. The family was no longer like others. The house itself took on a different weight. By day, it stood shuttered and still, a place of secrecy. By night, it became something else entirely, a vessel of suffering, spilling anguish into the air until even the trees seemed to lean away from it. Those who heard it more than once never forgot. The sounds followed them back into town, retold in low voices that carried more fear than fact. And through it all, the parents gave no word. They were seen only at dawn, faces lowered, moving briefly outside before retreating again. Their silence, once a habit, had now become resignation. They did not deny what was happening. They simply endured it, as though there were no fight left in them. The parents, once proud, now moved only at dawn. By the time the cries became a nightly fixture, the parents had all but disappeared from the life of the town. They were seen only at first light, when the ridge was still wrapped in mist and the roads lay empty. The father walked with his head bowed, carrying tools that seemed older than himself, his hands moving by habit rather than purpose. The mother drew water with slow, deliberate pulls, her eyes fixed on the rope, as if afraid to meet another's gaze. Neither offered greeting. Neither lingered long enough for a word to be spoken. Those who passed them described the same expression each time, faces lowered, lips tight, movements cautious, as though the act of speaking would betray more than silence ever could. Where once their distance had been a choice, now it seemed resignation. Their silence was not protective, it was surrender. The family no longer engaged with the rhythms that bound others together. They did not stand in church pews. They did not linger at markets. They no longer took part in any gatherings where their absence might draw question. Instead, their days seemed reduced to the simplest tasks, tending what food could still be coaxed from the soil, drawing water, keeping the children within walls that grew darker with each passing season. It was survival in its most narrow form, stripped of connection, of fellowship, of anything resembling hope. In town, silence spoke louder than confession. The parents' refusal to answer questions, their bowed heads and lowered voices, were read not as grief but as guilt. People said they must know what was happening in their blood and had chosen to hide it rather than face judgment. Some whispered they had brought it upon themselves by refusing marriage outside their kin, a secrecy that had now consumed their children's flesh. Others said the parents' quiet was proof of shame, that they carried knowledge too terrible. A voice. The absence of denial hardened suspicion. A rumor left unchallenged grows teeth of its own, and soon the family's silence was taken as certainty. Whatever afflicted the children was no longer seen as an accident of nature. It was spoken of as an inheritance, chosen and carried forward with each generation that refused to step outside its own shadow. Neighbors began to move with greater distance when the parents appeared. Paths that once allowed for a nod or brief exchange now cleared before them. What little was offered at first light, a sack of grain, a basket of corn, was left with no expectation of thanks. People gave not out of kindness, but from an uneasy desire to keep the family at the ridge, contained where they belonged. The parents did not protest. They collected what they needed and turned back up the path, faces still lowered as though the weight of their silence pressed them further into the earth. In the schoolyard, children saw and imitated what they witnessed. If the parents would not speak, the children would invent the words for them. Stories began to spread in whispers, growing wilder with each telling, until even the youngest knew the Ridge family's name without ever having seen their faces. Children in the schoolyard turned their silence into stories. The children of the Ridge had not been seen in the schoolhouse for many months, yet their absence was no barrier to their presence. Their name lingered in corners and behind desks, passed from mouth to mouth until it became a story more familiar than fact. It began as fragments, that their blood was too close, that their family had never sought outsiders, that the strange cries at night were proof of something carried in the body itself. The words were whispered with a mixture of awe and fear, repeated so often they lost their edge of rumor and hardened into belief. Teachers tried to cut it short. They struck rulers against desks, warned children to hold their tongues, and punished those who repeated the talk. But silence did little. The stories were not forgotten. They were pressed deeper, carried into alleys and fields, retold in the long walks home. Each retelling made the tale darker, sharper, less about what was known and more about what might be possible. The phrase, "too close," became enough. It was muttered with a shake of the head, a glance toward the Ridge, and nothing more needed saying. For the children who lived outside the hollow, it became a lesson of its own, to avoid names tied to that family, to step back from paths that bent in their direction, to carry distance in both thought and deed. The Ridge family had become not just neighbors, but an example of what happens when blood refuses to change. What began as gossip hardened into folklore. By the fire at night, parents scolded their own children with warnings. Never take food from that house. Never wander up the Ridge path. Never look too long if you see them in town. The stories shaped the way children played. Skipping stones became a dare to see who would throw one farthest toward the Ridge, though never close enough to risk its return. Even games of chase ended with sudden stops at the hollow's edge, the laughter dying as silence swallowed the ground beyond. The family themselves knew little of what spread below. Their silence kept them apart, their curtains drawn, their days measured only by survival. But the weight of rumor reached them all the same, in the way strangers moved, in the way even church prayers no longer carried their names. Isolation had turned to exclusion, and exclusion into certainty. Still, within the house, life pressed on. The cries at night grew harsher, the clothing heavier, the outlines beneath impossible to ignore. Yet the family endured, as if hoping secrecy could still shield them from what the town had already decided. But secrets do not hold forever. One boy, older now and restless under the weight of the hollow, tried to flee. He vanished into the woods at night, leaving only the echo of the doors opening behind him. For hours there was no sound, no sign of return. By morning he was back, bloodied, torn, the marks on his skin worse than before. His escape had lasted only long enough to prove that no escape was possible. Even attempts to leave the hollow failed. The boy chose his moment when the Ridge was at its quietest, the hollow drowned in the hum of crickets and the stir of night air. He slipped from the house without a word, bare feet carrying him across the yard and into the dark edge of the woods. For a time the trees swallowed him whole, and it seemed as if he had vanished for good. His absence lasted hours. Those within the house waited, though no voice called after him. Perhaps they knew that the Ridge offered no escape. Perhaps they were too weary to follow. Still, the silence of his leaving was a wound in itself. By dawn he was back. His body told the story without words. His clothes were torn, streaked with earth and blood. The skin along his arm and shoulder had been ripped raw, the unnatural growths broken open as though he had clawed at them in desperation. The torn flesh did not heal cleanly. Around the wounds, teeth remained fixed, jutting like stones half buried in soil, their roots holding fast despite his struggle to be rid of them. The boy did not explain. He moved past his family and shut himself away in the darkest corner of the house. There he remained, unwilling to be seen, unwilling even to step into the pale light of morning. The attempt had cost him too much. His silence afterward was heavier than before, a refusal not only to speak, but to be witnessed at all. The community noticed only fragments. Some said they glimpsed him limping at the edge of the yard, sleeves stained through, his body hunched as if under new weight. Others claimed he never came outside again, that he stayed hidden until his face itself was forgotten. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The Ridge family's isolation grew deeper, reinforced by failure. If the boy could not leave, no one could. Signs of pain lingered in the hollow. At night, the cries carried sharper, edged with desperation. Some swore they heard the potal, unding of fists against walls, followed by long silences that stretched until dawn. Others said the sounds had changed entirely, less human now, a mixture of groans and grinding that no one dared interpret. Still, no one climbed the ridge to see. Curiosity remained a distant impulse. Fear was closer, and fear held them back. The failed escape hardened what little resolve the family had left. If once they had dreamed of leaving, of seeking help or hiding among strangers, that dream ended with the boy's return. The hollow closed around them like a fist, sealing them inside. Their world shrank further still, rooms instead of fields, shadows instead of paths, silence instead of speech. Outside, life moved forward. The seasons turned, planting and harvest came and went. Children in town grew taller, older, and left the schoolyard behind. But on the ridge, the family's days no longer followed the same rhythm. For them, time was measured only in endurance. Inside the house, the changes advanced. Time on the ridge was not measured by growth or change, but by absence. Each year passed with fewer signs that the family still lived, until even the smallest traces became markers of their survival. In winter, smoke rose from the chimney, thin and uneven, a thread of gray that bent with the wind. It came less often than before, sometimes absent for days, then returning weekly, proof that someone within still fed the fire. The snow around the house lay unbroken, no tracks leading to road or field. From a distance, the place seemed abandoned, save for that faint plume against the sky. Summer brought a different silence. The windows stayed sealed, curtains drawn tight despite the stifling heat. Where other houses opened to catch a breeze, theirs remained shut, the air within surely heavy and stale. The yard, once tended at least enough to show life, grew wild with weeds and briars. Paths disappeared into grass. Even the garden patch, once worked by the father's hand, lay swallowed by thistles. Neighbors learned to mark time not by what the family did, but by what they no longer did. They did not appear at church even on holy days. They did not walk the market road when harvest came. They did not greet travelers or call out across fields. The rhythm of their absence became a season of its own, so regular that the town adjusted around it. Children who once whispered their name at school grew older, moved on, and carried different concerns. The family faded from games, from dares, from daily talk. They became instead a kind of warning passed quietly between generations. Don't wander up the ridge. Don't linger near that path. Their presence shrank to cautionary words spoken at dusk. The house itself was the only reminder. From the road, it slouched against the hillside, boards darkened with rot, roof sagging as though pressed by the years. No laughter, no cries, no music, only the shape of a dwelling that resisted collapse because those inside refused to let go. Travelers who came through the town spoke of it as a ruin, surprised to learn a family still lived within its walls. To those who lived near, it was not surprise but unease. The house stood too long without change, like a stone that weather refused to wear down. Time dulled memory, but memory never erased it completely. The ridge remained a place people passed quickly, turning their heads as they walked by. Some claimed they no longer thought of the family at all, but in truth, The silence pressed at them, reminding them with every season that something unnatural lingered just out of sight. And inside, time was marked differently. Where the town measured years in crops and sermons, the family measured them in endurance. Another winter survived, another summer endured, another year where no one came and no one left. Their bodies carried the burden quietly, hidden behind shutters and cloth, as though secrecy alone could hold back what grew within them. But secrecy did not stop it. The teeth did not rest. With every passing season they multiplied, pressing further outward, consuming flesh and bone alike. The teeth continued to multiply, consuming them. The first growths had been confined to arms and shoulders, but with time they spread unchecked. What began as isolated protrusions became clusters, each one pressing through in new and unnatural places. Along the boy's forearm, the scattered teeth multiplied until they formed rows, crooked and uneven, stretching toward the wrist. His sisters showed the same along their backs, sharp ridges running parallel to the spine until it seemed another skeleton was forming just beneath the skin. Soon the face itself was not spared. Teeth broke through cheeks in scattered groups, some small as a child's first molar, others broad and flat like grinding surfaces. Their eruption left skin swollen and split, raw where the body refused to heal around them. At times they came loose, falling out as if they were baby teeth, leaving behind bloody gaps that closed only to give rise to new growths. Others fused into place, bone against bone, anchoring themselves so deeply that the flesh grew tight around them, unable to move without pain. The ribs, too, became sites of intrusion. Protrusions jutted through in rows that mirrored the cage of bone beneath, creating a second jagged frame that shifted when they breathed. Even lying still became torment, as though the body was bristling against itself, never at rest. The cries that once came only at night now carried through the day. They were lower, more constant, not sharp bursts of pain but steady groans of endurance. It was the sound of lives reduced to suffering, a sound that never ceased but only ebbed and rose like wind. No remedy was attempted. No doctor came up the ridge. No neighbor offered cure. The parents gave no sign of seeking relief, as though they understood that no salve or knife could undo what was unfolding. Their silence was not denial, but acceptance. This was their inheritance, and it would run its course without interfering. The house itself bore the weight. Curtains sagged where hands clutched them in the night, cloth stained dark at the seams where blood had soaked through. Floorboards carried marks where bodies shifted restlessly, searching for positions that gave no comfort. What little furniture remained grew worn and broken under the strain of constant use. Outside, the family was no longer seen. The heavy clothing that once betrayed the shapes beneath was replaced by total absence. No child ventured to the yard, no parent to the well. The ridge, once hushed, grew quieter still, silence broken only by the sounds that forced their way through the walls. In town, the family's name was no longer whispered. It had passed into something darker than rumor, something carried forward only as warning. People said nothing good could come from blood that closed in on itself, that the ridge had become its own grave long before death had come. And death was near. The cries weakened. The smoke that once rose weakly from the chimney grew rarer until weeks passed with no sign of life at all. Those who dared glance toward the ridge said the house itself seemed to sag lower, as if it too were sinking into the hillside. Eventually the house fell still. The end came without announcement. One spring morning, when the thaw loosened the ground and water ran quick in the gullies, the chimney gave no smoke. A day passed, then two, then a week. Neighbors who still watched the ridge from a distance waited for the thin gray thread to rise again, but it never did. When at last someone climbed part way up the path, they found the house standing open. The door hung crooked, the latch broken, as though it had been left unfastened for weeks. Windows gaped bare, curtains pulled down or torn away. Inside, the rooms lay hollow. What little furniture remained was overturned, the boards of the floor marked with scratches, some shallow, some deep, running in every direction. No fire smoldered in the hearth, no voices filled the air. The family was gone. No bodies, no belongings, no final trace beyond the walls themselves. It was as if they had walked out together and vanished into the hillside, leaving only silence behind. The emptiness unsettled those who found it. They did not linger. The rooms carried a heaviness that pressed against the chest, as though the walls themselves remembered what had taken place within them. The smell of earth and blood clung faintly in the corners, enough to drive visitors back outside without searching further. From that day forward, no one returned. The house remained, slouched into the ridge, its roof sagging, boards grayed and splitting. Weeds climbed through cracks in the foundation, ivy crawled across the windows, and the door never again closed fully. Children dared each other to approach, but turned back before stepping inside. Adults gave the path a wide berth, choosing longer routes rather than walk past the silent ruin. Seasons wore on, but the hollowed house did not collapse. It stood as if bound by what had once lived there, weathering rain and snow, creaking in storms, but never falling. Its persistence gave weight to the silence. For each year that passed without change, the unease surrounding it grew stronger. The family's disappearance was not spoken of directly. Instead, their absence became a lesson folded into other warnings, that some houses should not be entered, that some names should not be carried forward. At market, when strangers asked about the hollow, locals answered only with shrugs and glances, unwilling to stir the subject. In church, prayers for the dead never reached the ridge. Silence itself became the only remembrance allowed. What unsettled most was not that the family had died. It was that they had vanished. No graves were marked, no bodies buried, no proof that the suffering had reached its end. The lack of conclusion left the unease unfinished, hanging over the ridge like a shadow. The house became not a ruin, but a reminder, its stillness echoing louder than any cry that had once come from within. The family was gone, but not forgotten. Only memory of them remained, spoken carefully in warning. Decades passed, and the ridge never reclaimed its place in the life of the town. Paths that once led toward the hollow grew overgrown, swallowed by grass and bramble until only those who remembered knew where they ran. Children born long after the family's disappearance were taught, quietly and without explanation, to avoid that slope. Even without names or reasons, the warning held. Few questioned it. The house itself sagged deeper into the hillside, its roof caved in places, its walls bending under weather and time. Yet still it stood. Storms tore through the hollow. Floods carried soil from the ridge. Snow pressed heavy on the roof beams, but the house refused to fall completely. It became a ruin that lingered longer than it should, as if the earth itself hesitated to erase what it contained. The story of the family endured not in records but in speech, handed down like an heirloom, reshaped but never softened. People said their blood was too close, that generations without outsiders had left no room for change. What had once been whispered as possibility hardened into certainty, that the family's own lineage had turned inward until the body itself revolted. The teeth on skin became the mark of that collapse, a sign that even flesh had grown weary of carrying blood so entangled. For some, it was told as a curse. They said the cries heard in the hollow were punishment made visible, the price of defiance against the natural order. Others, quieter, spoke of it as a mystery without answer, a thing that happened once and could happen again, proof that not all decay comes from hunger or disease. In both tellings, fear did the work. The ridge became a place best left untouched. The family's name disappeared from ordinary use. It was not carved on stone, not listed in records, not spoken in prayers. If a stranger asked, they were met with silence, or at most a half gesture to "O'ward the ridge," and the warning not to go there. To remember was one thing, to name was another. Naming invited the past too close, and so the family survived only in fragments, glimpses of teeth pressing through cloth, the sound of muffled cries carried on night air. the image of parents walking at dawn with faces lowered. Each retelling carried its own details, some sharpened by time, some softened, but all circling the same truth, that the family had lived apart, had suffered in silence, and had vanished without leaving their dead behind. The ridge itself became their grave, unmarked and unvisited. Its trees thickened, its paths closed, but its silence remained. Those who strayed too near swore the air grew heavier, as though memory itself resisted being disturbed. In the end, nothing was proven, nothing explained. The family's suffering left no record beyond what people remembered and what the house itself had witnessed before it fell to ruin. Yet the unease endured, sharper for never having found resolution. The memory of teeth remained, an image impossible to reconcile, a story spoken carefully, in warning, a mystery unsolved but never forgotten. If you want more histories sealed in silence, like this one, make sure to like this video and subscribe to X Archives.